yikes, that's dangerous. Well, I only plan to speak for about an hour and a half, so I think we're getting comfortable over the Diet Coke. But I was thinking about various riffs on leadership and discovery, and the ways that life intersects with that. First of all, I remember when I told my mom, who was a fifth grade school teacher for 30 years, so I was going to go to grammar school in history, she said, "What for, honey? We already know what happened." So from her perspective, being a historian is the very opposite of being anything that involves discovery. That her idea was, well, we already know all the presidents and the capitals and things like that. What else would we really need while we do a historian? So I'm devoting much of my career to showing that we really don't know anything. And I'm sort of on the, even though I could be a cultural intellectual historian, that didn't call it one on the postmodernist and all this sort of stuff, pushing on those boundaries of what we know of discovery. And then also discovered that when I was a leader of the arts and sciences at Virginia, trying to figure out how do you knit together 26 departments across arts and sciences that had very little in common and a shared theme. I would go and visit all 26 departments of the anthropology at 9 o'clock, and drama at 11, and chemistry at 1, and then the other communication studies, and think, okay, what ties all these together? I came up with some proposal, and I realized we couldn't even agree on the word of what our main activity was. Half the folks thought that we did scholarship. The other half thought we did research. And my science friends said, we would never call what we do scholarship. And while we would, humanities and social sciences, think of what we're doing as research, the result of it would be scholarship. And a good science friend of mine said, you know what the right word for this is. I said, discovery. He said, that's right. It is discovery. It's the common theme of all that we do in universities. And so in a lot of the fundraising materials from then on, always define our common purpose as discovery. And the final third permutation of this pairing of words that I thought, as you just heard, I'm new in this job, in this leadership thing. And there's a whole lot of discovery going on right now. And after we've had a fascinating lunch, I'm going back and tracing the genealogy of the Jepson School, having the 15th anniversary this weekend, seeing Mr. Jepson over the weekend, and having breakfast with him on Monday, and trying to discover just what it was that led him to create this school, that led him to have the vision to do this and work with a faculty like Joanne Gill, and we're here on the ground floor making this and still, inventing, discovering just what leadership is. So those are sort of the different themes that came to mind when I was thinking of the words of leadership and discovery. I've had a chance to read, in the way that presidents read, the various the papers. It reminds me of Woody Allen's story. He said he took speed reading. He said he read War and Peace last night in 30 minutes. It's about Russia. And what I could see is that this is about leadership and discovery and all different permutations. I like the phrase "conducive to truth." Who's the philosopher here who wrote about that?
It may be me, but I'm not a philosopher.
Oh, well, excuse me. I read it as philosophy. But conducive to truth, I thought that was a great phrase that I shall now appropriate to do all that. And I can see. I think that page you got that gift you got covered any. But I wish that I could be with you the rest of the time. It looks that's really exciting sort of work. But I believe that I will be discovering that several hundred emails have accumulated during my good lunch with you folks. So I hope you have a great colloquium. We're glad to have you at the University of Richmond. I can't claim credit for anything at this beautiful school, but I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. The great colleagues here at the Jepson School, and I hope you have a great time. Thanks very much.
Hello again. I'm Tom Wren, if you have forgotten. I'd like to add my welcome, and Ed is now walking down the steps, but I want to thank him for giving that nice introduction and welcome to us. I want to say a few words. My duty here is to introduce our first speaker, but I just want to say this is a very interesting gathering, and the interesting thing about it here is we have all these very prominent scholars here from a variety of different disciplines, thinking and talking about and addressing leadership. Few of you would consider, maybe none of you would consider yourself leadership scholars, probably. And that's to the good, because it enriches the field. One of the goals of the Jepson School is to bring together the best academic minds and to act as a catalyst for scholars, can help us understand the nuances of leadership. And that can best be done by getting the best people in the various disciplines doing the best work together and talk about a topic of the day that we've chosen. Next couple of days, we'll undoubtedly have some issues of definition, I'm sure, and have to talk through about what it is we're trying to get at. But we're in the course here at the Jepson School of kind of defining the field and building the field, and contributions such as yours are extremely important. So we like to get together groups of people like this from different disciplines, often not overtly leadership studies individuals. And it's key just to get us all together and to be talking about some of these things. I talked to a few of you over lunch. Sometimes these things misfire a bit. Sometimes they're wonderful. They're always interesting. And the key, I think, is discussion. Just talking among ourselves about some of the issues that come up in these papers and things, and that's the key. So the best bet probably is to keep this as informal as we can. So I'll introduce each speaker on my watch, and then take my seat, and as soon as they're finished with their presentation, we'll open it to questions and things. And so I'll just be kind of a referee or traffic cop after that. Al and I will, and some others on the Jepson faculty, as well as you, will try to play out any leadership spin we might see in some of these things. So we can show you, to talk about some of the things that we see in the papers as they come up, perhaps. And we'll see if we can find any common ground to what we'll come up with in terms of leadership and discovery. So again, I welcome you, and I look forward to this. Like I say, this will be a very interesting couple of days, and also hopefully an enjoyable and fun couple of days. So let me introduce our first presenter. We begin with a psychologist, Morton Gernsbacher. Got her PhD from Texas at Austin, taught for a good while at the University of Oregon. We have, then she moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is now the Velas Research Professor and the Sir Frederick C. Bartlett Professor of Psychology. She heads a research lab there. She has been a Fulbright Scholar. She is currently past president of the American Psychological Society. Morton is an award-winning teacher. 1998, she received the Hillsdale Award for Distinguished Professional Accomplishment, which is the highest award by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I believe that now she's actively working for the rights of the disabled, among other things. This is one of her interests. Her title, as we see it up here, we did see it up there, was A Conspicuous Absence of Scientific Leadership, the Illusory Epidemic of Autism. And there it is. So I noticed we have some students coming in from a psychology class, so we are honored to have our students with us. So welcome, Morton.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today. John Stossel recently opined that if you're a scientist working for private industry, it helps to invent something useful. But if you're a scientist trying to get funding from the government, you're better off telling the world how horrible things are. And once people are scared, they pay attention. They may even demand the government give you more money to solve the problem. And indeed, on the presidential campaign trail last May, Hillary Clinton decreed,
we have an epidemic, and it is time we recognize the seriousness of it.
On congressional letterhead last June, Congressman Dan Burton, former chair of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, proclaimed, and on posh Nantucket Island last week, Suzanne Wright, wife of Bob Wright, former GE vice chairman and NBC CEO, declared, it's a health crisis, an epidemic that has to be stopped. To what epidemic were these public figures referring? The AIDS epidemic, an epidemic of avian flu, an epidemic of SARS? No, as Suzanne Wright lamented to a group of school-age children, I don't want you growing up, getting married, and having a baby with autism. Well, autism is a human variation characterized by atypical social interaction, atypical communication, and more focused than average interests. These autistic traits have most likely existed since humanity's origin, and in retrospect, numerous historical figures demonstrated many of these traits. For example, Hugh Blair of Borg, the 18th century Scottish landowner, Henry Cavendish, the 18th century British scientist, my son's favorite, Nikola Tesla, the prolific inventor, Glenn Gould, the Canadian pianist, Mo Norman, the Canadian golfer, Michael Ventris, the English architect, Albert Einstein, Thomas Jefferson, and Isaac Newton. But with the exception of Mo Norman, none of these influential individuals were ever considered, much less diagnosed, as being autistic during their lifetimes because the diagnosis of autism did not exist during their lifetime. Indeed, it would be not until the 1940s that the constellation of atypical social interaction, atypical communication, and more focused than average interests would be known as autism, as Leo Kanner deemed it. Then another 40 years would elapse before American psychiatric practice incorporated standardized criteria for autism into what was by then the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Therefore, prior to 1980, any estimate of the prevalence of autistic persons would be based solely on an individual clinician's or a specific researcher's conception. Furthermore, as anthropologist Roy Grinker has convincingly argued in his recent book, Unstrange Minds, it would be impossible to reverse time and apply any era's diagnostic criteria without that era's accompanying societal context. For example, the advent of social justice movements, such as that which bore the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, helped reduce the stigma and enhance the opportunities available to persons with diagnosed disabilities. Well, autism remains in the most recent edition of the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but the diagnostic criteria have undergone significant changes, particularly between the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was published in 1980, and the fourth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was published in 1994. For example, a diagnosis according to the criteria published in 1980 required satisfying 6 mandatory stipulations. But a diagnosis according to the criteria published in 1994 involves simply meeting half of numerous options on a branching menu. Moreover, one need not be a semanticist to discern the contrast between the severe phrasing of the mandatory criteria published in 1980 and the more inclusive phrasing published in 1994. For example, the criteria published in 1980 required a pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people. But in contrast, the criteria published in 1994 involved only a lack of spontaneous seeking to share achievements with other people, or less sophisticated peer relationships than what developmental level would predict. As another example, the criteria published in 1980 required gross deficits in language development, but the criteria published in 1994 involved simply experiencing difficulty sustaining a conversation. Furthermore, whereas the 1980 diagnostic criteria involved 2 diagnostic categories that were based on the temporal onset of autistic traits, infantile and childhood onset, The 1994 diagnostic criteria comprise 5 diagnostic categories based on the obviousness of autistic traits. And 3 of those 5 categories connote what we commonly refer to as autism: autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which we abbreviate to PDD-NOS. Whereas autistic disorder requires meeting half that array of criteria that I mentioned a moment ago, Asperger's disorder requires meeting 2/3 of that half, and PDD-NOS is defined by sub-threshold criteria, that is, approaching but not fully meeting any of the diagnostic criteria. Moreover, current diagnostic practices allow, whereas the previous diagnostic practices prohibited, co-diagnosing autism alongside known medical and genetic conditions, such as Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. So keep in mind the purposeful broadening of the diagnostic criteria during the past 2 decades, the deliberate expansion of the diagnostic categories to include these less obvious phenotypes, which have been estimated to account for about 3/4 of current day diagnoses, the contemporary recognition that autistic individuals can present with every level of measured intelligence, from severely impaired to genius level, and the intentional effort to identify autistic children as young as possible. And then now consider the definitional criteria for an epidemic: the occurrence of cases in excess of what would be expected. That is, an increase beyond a rate that's likely or expectable. And you can see that the term autism epidemic doesn't meet that basic criterion. So how did the infelicitous use of the term autism epidemic arise? And why have so many scientists allowed the term to remain uncorrected? And my presentation today and the chapter I submitted provides that narrative related in order to illustrate a critical lesson in scientific leadership. In early 1998, 4 California fathers of autistic children dreamt of founding a joint research and clinical center to focus on autism. They would call it the Mind Institute, and they wanted to site it at the University of California, Davis Medical School. By June of 1998, the 4 California fathers had raised over $2.5 million from private donors. Then, courtesy of one of the 4 founding fathers, Rick Rollins, who was a former state Senate secretary turned high-powered lobbyist, the 4 fathers and their fledgling center received an additional boost directly from the California state legislature. A line item of $2 million was added to California's annual budget without a sunset clause. In November of 1988, the Founding Fathers gathered a who's who of California-based biological and behavioral scientists, most of whom had never researched autism, and they dangled before the scientists $1 million of their kitty to be awarded via fast-tracked research competition and the planned construction of a new facility, which would carry a $28 million price tag, for which the Founding Fathers would clearly need more funds. Well, one of Rick Rollins' lobbying clients was the California Department of Developmental Services, which is a statewide collection of agencies that provide services for individuals with developmental disabilities, such as autism. And because the previous diagnostic criteria for autism had been purposely replaced with broader and more inclusive diagnostic criteria, it was only to be expected that more autistic individuals would qualify for these California services. However, Rollins encouraged the California Department of Developmental Services to document those increases, which they did in a study released with great fanfare in March of 1999. State study finds sharp rise in autism rate, shouted the headline of the LA Times. Autism spike sets off alarms, alerted the San Jose Mercury News. The increased number of individuals who qualified for services was described as huge and unexpected, a description propelled by the newly appointed director of the Mind Institute, who was quoted as saying, "It's a dramatic report, but what's shocking is that it's not clear what the cause is." Bernard Rimlin, a longtime California autism advocate who had founded the Autism Society of America many years before, but whose later interests had turned to questionable treatments such as megadoses of vitamin B/C and the dubious, if not harmful, peptide hormone secretin, proclaimed, "We're in the middle of an autism epidemic," and a phrase was born. The next week, Edward Ritvo, Professor Emeritus of UCLA Medical School and a venerable autism researcher, attempted to douse what he read as panic. In a newsletter article titled "No Epidemic of Autism," Ritvo stated that the results of the California Department of Developmental Services study were cause for cheer, not fear. The increase reflected the successful efforts of previous autism researchers to broaden the diagnostic criteria so as to identify these less obvious phenotypes. Ritvo outlined 3 additional encouraging reasons for the increase: the success of efforts to raise awareness of autism by physicians and the public, the increased availability of public agencies and schools that provide necessary services, and the fortunate closure of state and private, quote, warehouses, meaning institutions, in which many autistic people had previously been improperly diagnosed and housed. Indeed, Ritvo calmly concluded that, quote, "The prevalence figures that are emerging just now from California and Illinois are in line with recent figures from Japan and other countries that have recognized the existence of milder cases of autism for several years. Thus, the increased figures come as no surprise to those following the international epidemiological literature," unquote. However, once spawned into the popular vernacular, the term autism epidemic proliferated. The term recurred almost weekly in the California-based Families for Effective Autism Treatment newsletter, which was electronically distributed to 7,000 readers. News items were glossed by the editor, so the headline, "Rising Rate of Autism in State," was relabeled in this newsletter to be "San Jose Mercury News Reports on the California Autism Epidemic." And a New York Times article about AIDS was relabeled, "A Look at AIDS, That Other Immune Disease Epidemic." In another attempt to stem the tide, similar to Edward Ritvo's earlier stab, Canadian researcher Eric Fambone published in the journal Pediatrics a critique of the California Department of Developmental Services report. Noting first that the report has been and still is widely quoted as evidence for an epidemic of autism, Fambone concluded that the data provide no basis for the claim, and there is no need to raise false alarms on putative epidemics or to practice poor science. When interviewed in the prestigious journal Science, Fambone responded even more frankly. The grounds for an increase are completely non-existent. The rise in demands for services can probably be traced to an increased awareness of the condition, more common referrals due to the availability of better services, and an ever-broadening definition of just what constitutes autism. Fambone's reasoning corroborated perfectly that of longtime autism researcher Edward Ritvo. Nonetheless, David Amaral, a behavioral neuroscientist who by then had been appointed the research director of the Mind Institute, objected. "I'm still not convinced that there hasn't been an actual increase," demurred Amaral. Apart from Canadian researcher Fambone and California emeritus researcher Ritvo, the rest of the scientific field remained publicly silent. No other scientist attempted to calm the storm or to extinguish the wildfire of a false epidemic. In June 1999, lobbyist and founding father Rick Rollins reported that the California legislature would be contributing another $3 million to the Mind Institute, with another $1 million specifically earmarked to study the epidemic of autism in California. Meanwhile, on the national front, the Advancement in Pediatric Autism Research Act, which had been introduced by Senator Slate Gordon, had been languishing for over a year. It had been read twice, but hadn't been scheduled for debate. So during the summer of 1999, buoyed by the Department of Developmental Services California report of these increased services attached now to the indelible term autism epidemic, John Shestak, co-founder of the California-based foundation Cure Autism Now, rallied the troops. Shestak, a Hollywood producer, and his wife, Portia Iverson, an Emmy award-winning set designer, had become well known for their dramatic rhetoric about autism. Iverson likened being the parent of an autistic child to, quote, the village of the damned. And Shestak reiterated in several major media outlets, Newsweek, 60 Minutes, even the august Journal of the American Medical Association, that having an autistic child was one of the worst nightmares a parent can imagine, because without warning, a child is abducted from his bed in the middle of the night, never to return. Now, imagine, instead of taking the whole child, only his mind is stolen, and his body, the hollow shell of his being, is left behind. If 1 in every 250 children in America were actually being abducted, that would be a national emergency. But that's what's happening with autism. Shestak's refrain of autistic children as mindless hollow shells and his repeated allusion to Elizabeth Short-like abductions epitomize Stossel's facetious advice for crowbarring government funding. Tell the world how horrible things are, and once people are scared, they pay attention. They may even demand the government give you more money to solve the problem. So to power the passage of the Federal Advancement in Pediatric Autism Research Act, Shestak's organization directed parents of autistic children to call their Congress members and, quote, tell them that autism is a truly devastating disorder. While it will not affect the lifespan of those with autism, individuals with autism require a lifetime of services, interventions, and struggles, all of which are a tremendous financial and emotional drain on not just families, but our nation as a whole, unquote. In September 1999, Shestak organized a rally on Capitol Hill. Geraldine Dawson, a longtime autism researcher, appeared before the Senate's Public Health Subcommittee, testifying that while autism was, quote, once thought to be rare, unquote, the prevalence had increased so rapidly that it now affected more children than did cancer. Actress Renee Rousseau made personal visits to key senators' offices and testified that, quote, we've lost a generation of children. State by state, congressional votes were won through parents' repetition that, quote, autism is a truly devastating disorder. And in October 2000, the Advancement of Pediatric Autism Research Act, relabeled the Children's Health Act, passed Congress. This $75 million National Institutes of Health pot of gold was distributed among 8 research groups, 5 of whom had shared a $45 million NIH pot 3 years earlier and would share another $60 million NIH pot 2 years later. As you can imagine, not one researcher funded by the nearly $250 million NIH dollars, including researchers who had been directly responsible for purposely broadening the 1994 diagnostic criteria, ever publicly questioned the verity of an illusory autism epidemic. 2 years later, in October 2002, the Mind Institute, which had been funded on the claim of there being an autism epidemic and had been given additional funds to study the basis of the autism epidemic, that is to empirically investigate whether it was a real epidemic or whether the increase could be due to broadened diagnostic criteria and other factors, released the results of their study. Does anyone want to guess what they concluded? Well, first the study reported that in 1987, 2,778 autistic individuals had received services, whereas in 1998, 10,360 autistic individuals had received services, leading to a 273% increase, which they concluded, to quote from the San Francisco Chronicle, could not be explained by loosening of criteria. This conclusion licensed the New York Times to label the 273% increase a mysterious upsurge. CBS News deemed it a baffling outbreak, and the conclusion promulgated throughout the internet. But as my colleagues and I suggested in a subsequently published peer-reviewed journal, article, this conclusion was marred by a serious lapse of logic. So let me show you how. The study had collected 2 samples of children. One sample, the earlier cohort, had been born between 1983 and 1985 and most likely entered the Department of Developmental Services around 1987. The other sample, the more recent cohort, had been born between 1993-95 and most likely entered the Department of Developmental Services around 1997 or 1998. Both cohorts were assessed using the same diagnostic instrument, an interview conducted with the child's caregiver. However, the fatal flaw of the study was that the diagnostic instrument was based on only the more recent, purposely broadened 1994 diagnostic criteria, which of course was not even published until many years after the earlier cohort had entered into the Department of Developmental Services. So when the same percentage of children in the earlier and more recent cohort met the broader 1994 criteria, the researchers concluded that the 273% increase could not possibly be due to changes in diagnostic criteria. But a diagnostic instrument based on broader criteria can easily identify the same percentage of individuals who meet a broader criteria as a more restricted criteria. Let me show you using the following analogy based on male height. Suppose in the mid-1980s the criterion for tall was 6'2.5" and taller, but a decade later, in the mid-1990s, we changed the criterion. We broadened it so that tall now means merely 6 foot tall and taller. Well, a diagnostic instrument based on the broader, more recent criteria of 6 foot would identify males who meet the broader criteria as well as the males who meet the more restricted criteria. If a male is tall, according to the 6'2" criteria, 6'2.5" criteria, he's tall according to the 6 foot criterion. And while a perfectly reliable diagnostic instrument would identify 100% of both of those groups, a more, a typical diagnostic instrument might identify about 90% of each group, or about the percentage identified in the Mind Institute study. To make this even more concrete, I can use census data from McClellan County, Texas, to estimate that 2,778 males would be called tall by the more restricted 6'2.5" criterion, and 10,360 males would be called tall by the broader 6 foot criterion. But if we had applied those two criteria for tall 10 years apart, we would be lulled into believing that there had been a 273% increase in the number of males we call tall, even though there had been no change in Texans' height. Well, in the same way, that 273% increase from 2,778 Californians being served by the Department of Developmental Services and 10,360 Californians being served by the Department of Developmental Services could well be a function of broadening the diagnostic criteria. In addition to California-based claims of an autism epidemic, which were based on increasing numbers of autistic individuals in the California Department of Developmental Services system, national claims of an autism epidemic were made based on increasing numbers of autistic children in the federal special education program. For example, in October of 2003, the Autism Society of America sent its 20,000 members the following electronic message. Figures from the most recent U.S. Department of Education's 2002 report to Congress on IDEA reveal that the number of students with autism in America's schools jumped an alarming 1,354% in the 8-year period from the school year 1991-92 to 2001. However, what the Autism Society of America failed to note was the following important fact. Prior to 1991-92, there was no way to count the number of autistic school children because autism didn't even exist as a federal reporting category. Moreover, in 91-92, the use of the autism reporting category was optional, required only in subsequent years. Obviously, whenever a new category is introduced, if it's viable, increases in usage will ensue. My colleagues and I reported in a published journal article the reporting category traumatic brain injury, as an example, was also introduced along with autism in 91-92, and it soared an astronomical 5,000% during that period. Similarly, the reporting category developmental delay, which was introduced only in 97-98, grew 663% in only 3 years. Well, after the initial year, the number of autistic school children being served in the public schools has increased by, on average, 23% per annum. Why the continuing increase? Well, as with cellular phones and high-speed internet, or I guess better yet, more relevant example would be iPhone purchases, new options aren't capitalized on instantaneously. They require incrementally magnified awareness and augmentation or reallocation of resources. For instance, this is a graph of the incremental increase in internet use in peach, personal computer usage in purple, and cellular phone usage in yellow. Most interesting, the lavender bars represent the use of land telephone lines, and moreover, these data are from Ghana. And what's interesting is that Ghana has had land telephone lines erected for many years. But note that their increase in usage parallels other increase in technology and communication that are more novel. So returning to autism, currently no state reports serving in their public schools the number of autistic children who would be expected based on large-scale epidemiological studies, and that's about 6 per 1,000. So we will expect this graph, this curve, to continue growing higher. But despite increasing awareness of the purposeful broadening of diagnostic criteria, increased understanding of the limitations of the national education data, and more logical considerations of the Mind Institute's time trend study, alarmist rhetoric continues. 2 weeks after the December 2004 catastrophic Sumatra Andaman earthquake triggered the devastating tsunamis that killed nearly 250,000 people, Rick Rollins, founding father of the Mind Institute and California state lobbyist, likened the increasing number of autistic individuals receiving Department of Developmental Services to a tsunami growing rapidly. In their fundraising material, the Mind Institute has such gems as this flyer, which says, "You can't die from autism. You can't really live with it either." The bottom of the flyer says, quote, "Personal time, privacy, disposable income. Having a child means sacrificing a few things. Having an autistic child means sacrificing everything. Autism is a complex neurological disorder that breaks the brain of a child and shatters the lives of every person in the family." And then, of course, there's a 1-800 number to phone with one's donations. By the way, have I mentioned that I'm the parent of an autistic child? I'm the mother of a delightful, clever, loving, and spirited and beautiful child who most likely, as I'm speaking right now, is out looking at the gorgeous sights in Richmond and preparing for his AP course in U.S. history. But you know, such accolades and mild descriptions don't garner public and government funding, as illustrated, for example, by Tom Insel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which has become the primary NIH institute for funding autism research. He described autism in a Newsweek article as an astonishingly devastating disease. And in USA Today article, he said that autism is a tremendously disabling brain disease which really robs a child and a family of the personhood of this child. When a community member questioned the ethics of describing any group of children with such dehumanizing terms, much less the director of a National Institute of Health doing so, Insel replied that he had modeled his rhetoric after Hollywood producer John Shestak, who Insel described as having been very eloquent on the subject of autistic children. At a large public professional conference in 2005, Director Tom Insel used the national education data to alarm the audience of this growing public health challenge. However, a recent editorial published just the beginning of the summer in the prestigious journal Nature provides a more realistic dark side to the myth of an autism epidemic. And that is, as NIH's funding of autism has dramatically increased over the past 5 to 6 years, NIH's funding of other critically important areas, such as childhood leukemia and cystic fibrosis, has dramatically decreased. The Hungarian biochemist and 1937 Nobel laureate defined discovery as seeing what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought. And I submit that leadership in scientific discovery also involves saying what no one else has said. Recall the fabled young boy who distinguished himself from the obsequious masses by announcing not the presence, but absence of the emperor's new clothes. And scientific leadership requires that same earnest courage, but only a handful of scientists have shown such leadership in regard to autism research, and the majority of those who have dared pull the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, interestingly enough, are also parents of autistic children, such as myself, and one of my collaborators is an autistic individual herself. As Robert Crease has aptly articulated, leadership is most conspicuous by its absence. But I'll end on just a brief flash of hope, and I'm going to try to tell this anecdote without naming names. When I approached one of the current presidential candidates about his or her infelicitous and repeated use of the term autism epidemic and the alarming rhetoric that is accompanied by that use of the term, all I received in response was a form letter reiterating the direness of the situation, the devastation, and the doom. When I approached another, I was delighted that he or she listened to my scientific reasoning and then removed all uses of the term autism epidemic from campaign material. This candidate is clearly supportive of autistic individuals and their families, but now has chosen to do so without reference to an illusory autism epidemic. So thank you for your attention today.
What you've been saying here today reminds me of this sort of uncomfortable paradox of global warming with the Hollywood people involved, and that's just frightening.
The Hollywood people, one should never underestimate. I mean, there was the California group I showed at the beginning of my slide, Bob Wright and Suzanne Ride, who have connections that are extraordinarily deep in the entertainment community. And the interesting thing is that in many of these galas and affairs and the like to raise awareness and support for autistic individuals, what you never see are autistic individuals. You know, if you think that these are the numbers of children who we're diagnosing currently, there exists that same number of autistic adults living and being supportive and probably, I'll leave that for other speculation. They have a very, very active community on the internet, but nonetheless, you don't see these individuals being supported at these, you know, huge bashes and fundraising and walks and, you know, the charity. I mean, the parallel is also a lot like, which just occurred, you know, the Jerry Lewis telethon, where there's all this pity party, this kind of queen for a day mentality, but you rarely see adults with muscular dystrophy on that show. And in fact, the adults with muscular dystrophy, I don't know if any of you have followed this, this is wearing my other hat with regard to disability rights, are outraged that, you know, their countenances have been played for such pitiful support.
And if I may just follow up on what I said, because I get so fed up when I hear this sort of thing, is that the climate aspect, there's so many more data available thanks to satellites and so on. So it's a sort of a parallel. We have a lot more information now than we had 50 years ago, so we're interpreting without realizing that there's a historic thing.
Yeah, that there's, right, a context. Yeah. Well, as I said, I showed those public figures at the beginning, and clearly not all of them one would even today say, you know, they would fit those criteria, but there have been published papers on each of them arguing for those traits. As I said, my son's a great fan of Nikola Tesla, and you can't read even an autobiography of Nikola Tesla without realizing how obsessed many of his ideas were. He remained celibate through his life. In fact, one of his great quotes is that I don't think you can name a great invention that was invented by a married man. And he really saw his focus and his perseverance on his work to be the most important thing in his life. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to get to the heart of the ethical argument that you're making here, because
I'm sorry, the heart of the ethical argument.
Because it emerged fairly late
Mm-hmm.
in the argument of the paper and of your presentation.
Good point.
And yet it was anticipated by the rhetoric that you used. It led us to believe that we were going to get an ethical payoff in the end, and we did. But I'd like to press you a little bit to see if you could make it a little more explicit, because it seems to me that's the heart of the argument that you're setting before us. And the more explicit it could be, the easier it would be to engage in a helpfully critical way. Because there are two other examples that I'm aware of that have a similar kind of trajectory of increasing public awareness. One is of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, and its association very early in the 1960s with the Boston Red Sox, and then the Hollywood People Coming Fair, and its great success in reducing childhood cancers. So that's a story that would formally seem to be somewhat parallel, though I'm not sure that the ethical critique would be the same there. It's another one that's perhaps not as directly relevant. So I'm keenly interested in the argument, but I'd like you to, if you could, to lift up what you take to be the fundamental ethical argument.
Right. Well, I think the distinction is between, for example, awareness and support versus the alarmist rhetoric for funding science and research that is really not at all fed back to supporting, I think, cancer and accommodating autistic individuals. Cancer, because it is a medical disease. Autism isn't a medical disease, and you know, we're $2.5 billion down the pike. And I would say, quite honestly, that not one autistic citizen's life has been improved with those $2.5 billion. And I'm not alone. You can get on the internet. I was mentioning to Dave this morning that when I was, Googling to get a picture of Tom Insel for this presentation, I got to blogs before I got to the NIH website because many autistic citizens are very angry that this extraordinary amount of money has been raised And unlike a disease where you can go in and study it and fix it, we haven't seen that. Moreover, another ethical issue that isn't present in this paper, and I'm not sure how it could be worked in, but I would feel comfortable doing so if people felt like it would make a good addition, is that a vast majority of autistic citizens do not want to be cured. They actually like their atypicality. Sure, they like the less of the inconvenience of any disability, and who wouldn't? But there's really a strong advocacy, self-advocacy and pride of the notion of being autistic that has developed in the last 10 years at the same time that this alarmist rhetoric has been going. But back to just kind of where is the money going and what is it helping with? Just last week there was a study published on an autism model, animal model in the fruit fly. Now, chances are this is an ongoing fruit fly lab who wanted to have some research money, so they decided to do a study or two that might be relevant to autism and get this nice bounty of money and go on about their business. And I'm not going to, I'm not an accountant. I'm not going to go back and look at each and every dollar that has come the way of autism researchers, but I think most of them realize that it's been, a gravy train at this point, and you can, Google or PubMed to see that the actual science that's been done has not fed back to help the individuals for whom it was intended.
I agree. I think the ethical thing is the key part. I'm at the risk of sounding like a lowlife here. I'd like to give a counter argument and just to see where it takes us. I think it has a larger impact on several papers we have before us. These people are, they're trying, they fib, let's say, or they, or more, but they got a great deal of money for a good cause, right? So you begin to think about, well, what should you do in this case? And somebody just behind me, Joanne, would say, well, you just don't fit and never do it. I mean, that's not what you do. But in a way, it helped their cause. And I think about science in general being so dependent on public policy and public funding. I see lots of things in our papers where people are doing risky or unethical things because of the political sphere. And I'm just wondering if science and public policy or politics, they're such uneasy bedfellows. If there's something that it's a unique situation. So
well, I'll weigh in, and I won't self-disclose whether I would fib or excuse me.
This is questions for everybody.
Okay, I didn't say I won't weigh in and say whether I would fib or not fib, although I was one of the ones who came out and said, wait a minute, I wrote a paper that said 3 reasons not to believe in an autism epidemic, and other people have written papers as well. They've actually received death threats. They've received, I'm not kidding, this has been documented in Nature. I managed to emerge unscathed from all this, and I think it's because I tend to be kind of a cautious person anyway, and all my arguments are extremely well documented. But to go back to what you first said about a really good cause, and the question is, was it a really good cause? Was that $35 million building at UC Davis, has it helped autistic citizens? Or has it helped researchers who claim to be helping autistic citizens? Hillary Clinton stumping on the campaign trail, even as recently as May, when the data show us there is no evidence for, the technical definition of an epidemic. Let's say she gets another bill or, act passed. Is it going to help? Does it really, how, quote, good is that cause? And I think that's really, maybe to come back to your question, that's not something I drew out very well in this paper, and surely could, because I feel pretty strongly about it, which is raising funds for something that you think is, is bad or whatever. It seems like a good cause, but in these cases, I would submit it was the cause was just increasing research spending. Everyone knows in the field of, I have to refer to Dave here, but everyone knows in psychology and the like, if you want to get something funded, attach it to autism. It's very easy. It can be anything. It can be hot air ballooning. How do people respond to hot air ballooning? Use the word autism and you'll get it funded. That's the ticket now. And so is the cause really that good? And kind of back to this disability rights and ethics, many of the individuals, when you listen to autistic individuals, from my son, age 11, to many of the adults. They say, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want to be manipulated. We don't want to be plastered as poster children. We don't want everyone to think that we're hollow, empty shells who were abducted in the night. No thanks. I know you have a handout. I'll just add one more little anecdote. Last year there was another big round of autism funding, and one of the NIH staffers phoned me to ask if I would serve on the review panel, and he had remembered 8 years earlier that I had served on a review panel when that first round of funding came in, and he said, very tongue-in-cheek, so is your son's life a whole lot better in the 8 years of NIH funding? I think everyone realizes that the good cause of it, or the cause of it, hasn't always been to help the actual individuals whose faces and personages have been used in this way. Yes.
I actually think you have two critiques there. One I'd say is a sort of instrumental critique. The rhetoric isn't good. The alarmist rhetoric isn't good because it's not helping the cause, which opens you up to the response, well, if the alarmist rhetoric did help the cause, would the alarmist rhetoric be okay? And I think your point is that it's not okay because the alarmist rhetoric is dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, for me that
Yeah,
seems
that's
to be
right.
something.
And actually that is. I mean, you helped me articulate that those are really the two arguments, that the alarmist rhetoric, even if it was a great cause, even if it was something like childhood cancer or whatever, is still dehumanizing. You don't go around talking about individuals as being hollow shells whose, souls were stolen in the middle of the night. And that, et cetera. That there's a father in Canada who testified to the Senate that, that autism is worse than cancer because autistic individuals have a normal life expectancy. You just don't say that. These are people. These are humans. But I think the other is kind of where have the funds gone for? And have we really, if those $2.5 billion would really be helping my son's life or helping other individuals' life or even directly given to those people. I mean, actually communities are starting to fight back. I just read on a fundraising blog last week that a community in Vermont told Suzanne Wright and Bob Wright that they didn't want them to come in and fundraise. They would rather fundraise themselves because they give the money directly back to the community, whereas Bob and Suzanne Wright take the money and give it to the national researchers. And I'm a hardcore scientist, don't get me wrong, but they're not seeing that payoff with regard to really helping those individuals. Yes.
The other thing that astonishes me, I guess to me the bad guys in all of this are the rest of the scientific community.
Yeah.
I would hope that my undergraduate history majors would look at your analogy of height and realize this is a completely fallacious argument.
Yeah.
What epidemic are they talking about?
Yeah. I think, yeah.
That seems not the fact.
Right. I think that was, and I probably didn't do a very good job, but that was really kind of given the topic of leadership where I was trying to take my presentation and my chapter. So any feedback to me about better shaping that up, because I do think that was the conspicuous absence of leadership. When you have individuals who are in line to get this money, who were also the ones who, for very good motivation, purposely broadened the diagnostic criteria and then won't speak out and say, there's nothing to be alarmed here, we've done this on purpose. It doesn't mean that, and in the reality, it doesn't mean we don't still need to study it. It doesn't mean we don't need to still help autistic individuals, but to do so in these straight terms. But it's really been the scientists who have not spoken out, and in fact have even gone farther than just complicity by absence. Many of them, when pressed and said, well, is there really, or is this just due to broader diagnosis? They'll say, oh, we just don't know. We just don't know. So it's really that model of, where were they? Why weren't they calming the fears? And they knew that if they didn't, or if they did douse it, then there wouldn't be the $2.5 billion of NIH funding to play with.
Along these same lines, would your critique of the New York Times be an intellectual critique or ethical critique?
It's interesting.
Don't they know better?
I think they do, right. I think they do now. And I think the presidential candidate, who I mentioned at the end, should now. I really do. Did they know in 2002? No. I think they were just kind of, listening to the scientists who had to say that. I think now they do, and there have been enough people speaking out. Roy Grinker, anthropologist at George Washington, myself, Paul Shattuck, who's at WashU, also the parent of an autistic kid. The interesting thing is, in terms of, to kind of give the background story, the parents of autistic children who have spoken out and have, written about this, have done so because we've been so horrified at the alarmist rhetoric. Had the claims of an epidemic gone on, but they weren't accompanied with these dehumanizing tones, I probably wouldn't have gotten involved. So it is kind of had that kind of catch-22. But in terms of the media, I think they do now. And I know that a recent article, virtually you can't pick up an article now that says there's been this rapid increase, but most scientists think that it's because of blah, 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 as opposed to a few years ago. Oh, sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is great. And when I read this the other night, I ran right into my wife. She's a pediatrician. And she was delighted with it because one of the things that she deals with a lot is ADHD.
Same thing.
The same type of dynamic.
Same thing.
About.
Same story. Now it's in childhood bipolar. Get ready.
So we started going back and forth with the why. And of course, it's a mixture of money and political opportunism, of drug companies, of researchers, of media frenzy, all these kinds of things. But, at the end of the day, that's not all that surprising. I mean, people are people, and that's the way. Politicians are always politicians. Journalists are always journalists, right? And scientists are not necessarily living on this ethical Olympus. But I wonder if there's something else in there, something that's actually more pernicious and something that's more broadly cultural. Is it in this society today, not only in our society, but I think in the larger Western world now, have we really become fixated with defining down what normal is,
Yeah,
defining up what normal
absolutely.
is? In other words, now
Absolutely.
there's a perfect storm in some
Absolutely.
ways because it's all of the normal things you would expect to
Absolutely.
see with media and politics and money. But now you're mixing it in with a little bit of cultural
Absolutely.
fixation
Absolutely.
about defining down what normal actually
And choice, and the era of choice. I mean, technology has brought us choice, correct? And I think the other lace, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the other lacing on that is our purposeful reduction in family size. So now, on average, we choose to have, 2.2 children, and we want both of them to be damn good. Whereas, when we were having families of 13 and 15 or however many, you could have a few oddballs and it didn't really matter. And now you see this is the same model that you see in the high rates of gendercide. I mean, I often say to people, and I'm as pro-choice, I'll come right out and tell you I'm as pro-choice as they come, but I will caution people to remember that the number one or the highest percentage by millions of selective prenatal screening and abortion are done for the disability known as femaleness. And, around the world, the highest number of prenatally screened and aborted fetuses have the disability called femaleness. And that kind of gets us back to this whole model of disability, which is disability is, whatever isn't being valued and appreciated in that culture.
It's tight notion of normal. So you think potentially what you're robbing the world of. According to your thing, you're robbing the world. I agree with you.
Well,
You can clearly be seen as a nut job.
Absolutely.
If you go over and you see like the kinds of things he did when he was in college, when he was, and afterwards a fellow at Cambridge, it was absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like people say that intellectuals and saints are the nut jobs. I mean, in many ways, because we've defined now what normal is, it doesn't leave a place for that kind of real unique genius.
I agree. My son and I mean, I'll tell this anecdote. I don't know how we're doing on time. A few years ago when my son became knowledgeable about Nikola Tesla, he was supposed to be reading in his literature book, a piece of historical fiction, or a piece of, historical semi-fiction, and he was giggling, and I was downstairs working, and I thought, he's gone, he's not reading, he's watching a DVD. So I walked up and I said, what's so funny? And he was reading, and he's, and he types to communicate because he can't speak very well. And he said, Mom, I had no idea. And I said, no idea about what? And he said, I had no idea that there were other people in the world who visualized experiments in their head. And this is, what Nikola Tesla self-reported all the time, is he only did physical experiments to prove them to other people. He had already computed them in his head, and he knew exactly the way that they would work. And so this kind of launched this entire discussion that my son and I had, that Nikola Tesla looked like he was on the autism spectrum, and we read tons of stuff, and we were pretty convinced. And then my son said, but he never was diagnosed that way. He was never called that. And he saw that as could be a plus in that regard. And I said, sweetie, that's what your life needs to do, which is that you can still be called these things, because my son's going to be called autistic whether, we can be in Logan Airport and the cleaning person will come in and say, oh, is your son autistic? Yeah. My son will be called that way. It's like skin color for him. He's a very obvious autistic individual. It's a very outward. And what we need to do is make the world change so that it's not a negative, that it has no value, that it's just it. It's like saying that you're purple or green, or that you have blonde hair, or you're Jewish, or you're Catholic. It has no value to it. It's just it. And that's what we need to do, because otherwise this rampingly escalating diagnosis, every family's going to have a diagnosis pretty soon, that's all there is to it, and the pathologizing, I agree, is not going to help our society develop and grow in these creative ways that we want to.
We are about out of time. Was there somebody else trying to get in?
Well, I wasn't trying to get in, but so I'm jumping the line. But I would like to come in if I may, because I thought I was thinking very much along the same lines as Patrick. I think normalcy is a general source of tyranny nowadays, and it's kind of dangerous phenomenon. But there's still a specific problem about why society is reacting with increasing vehemence against autism, because at level you're describing a kind of persecution, a kind of repression. And it's very curious one to me, and I just feel that you can maybe help me understand something about the United States, which I have
Sure.
so far been incapable of understanding. See, if I'm right, and I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't know a lot about it. If I'm right, what I think people find disagreeable, what makes people uncomfortable with autism, what makes those parents feel so desperate and so helpless. Many parents who just don't perhaps have your resources, your intellectual resources and emotional resources to cope with an autistic child. The source of this anxiety that autism inspires in society is that all autistic people typically are unsocial. They're not outward going, they don't relate to us in the way that we expect, they seem very egotistical, self-absorbed. These are all kind of unsocial characteristics. So it's a sort of social condition, really, rather than perhaps a mental one. But the curious paradox here is that what you've described, this increase in anxiety about autism, has coincided almost exactly from the 70s to the 90s with a period in the history of the United States when the general trend of cultural values has been increasingly individualistic. In other words, society has become more unsocial and more individualistic and has valued egotism more highly. It has become more, kind of enfiefed to capitalist values, which are also all about, seeking your own advantage and as the hope that the invisible hand will somehow generalize the benefits. That seems to me to be a most extraordinary paradox. And why is it? I mean, Patrick's absolutely right about the general phenomenon, but why is autism being targeted at a period when, I think we historians would have predicted almost the opposite?
Sure. Those are all great points. I think autism, the core reason that, quote, autism is being targeted is because of those expanding definitions that occurred during that period. But your point with regard to, is it this challenge or this fear of the relationship that a parent is going to have with an autistic child. And I think that there's probably some really good basis for that fear. Having said that, it's not the case that all individuals being diagnosed have these extraordinarily withdrawn and severe impairments in social interaction. As I gave the examples of the diagnostic criteria, it's, for example, not being able to make chit-chat. Well, I'm sorry, but a lot of the faculty in my department meet that criteria perfectly. The worst is, here's a good example, here's a good microscopic example, is lack of eye contact. Now, who does eye contact help? It doesn't help the individual if they're getting information through their periphery vision, which is what our data suggests. Eye contact helps me. I want you to look at me, because if you're not looking at me, I don't think you like me, I don't think you're paying attention, I don't think whatever. And that's a lot of the model. So going back to what you said, this is my own little far-stretched hypothesis, which is there is such a thing as what's called the broader autism phenotype. I mean, autism is a genetic condition, and it, despite all the news media that you guys have been hearing about the spontaneous mutations, that counts for about like 3%, despite the fact they just, crowbarred $8.2 million from the Simmons Foundation. It only accounts for 2%. So there's, autism, parents who have autistic children have some autistic traits. I have 2 named professorships. You don't get 2 named professorships without having like a huge amount of obsessiveness. I mean, that's all there is to it. And some other features. One of them, I believe, is also this narcissism. And so you get these narcissistic parents who say, my kid is terrible, it's the worst, it's the most horrific, whatever. Nobody could have it as bad as I do. No one could have it. And it's that narcissism, I think, that's also driving this whole rhetoric and doom and gloom. One quick anecdote, I lasted about 2 weeks on a discussion board of parents of children with special needs a couple of years ago with my son's school. And the parents of the autistic children would say, oh, our life is just so terrible, it's so horrible. And there are other parents of children with multiple severe disabilities. I mean severe, and health concerns, and surgeries, and short life expectancy. They seemed fine. And it was the parents of these children who weren't making eye contact and small talk that, were saying, oh, our life is terrible. I think that's the narcissism that is part of that genetic phenotype. Enough? All right, thank you very much.